Well, good afternoon. It's about that time to begin, if you'd like to take your seat. What an incredible week it has been. And all the lectures I've been to have been just so well done and powerful. And I will admit to you that when we first, in the Bible department, started talking about the lectures for this year, I could not envision how well received that they would be. And we talk about it being a collaborative effort within the department, but of course a lot of the work goes to the men who have done such a great job developing their lessons and presenting them. And I really want to thank each one of them for that. Also, I think it's only fair that you would know that the primary architect for the lectures of this year is Nathan Ward. And so I want to thank him for his vision and hard work he did on that. And I also want to thank you, because if you were not here, we would not have lectures. We would not even have a college. And I recognize that. And, you know, what I do here in presenting a faculty lecture in the afternoon is really just in a small way trying to show my thanks, a way of giving back. Each year that I work here, I'm even more impressed with the dedication and commitment of the people that work here to these young people, even generations that are not yet born. And we could not do that without your support. And I don't just mean financial support. We do need that. But you have entrusted us with the greatest treasure God has given you stewardship of, and that is the hearts and souls of your children and your grandchildren. And I try to remember that every time I go into the classroom. And I'm privileged to be a part of that. I have the greatest job in the world to teach the greatest book to the greatest young people. And again, I thank you deeply for that opportunity. Now, when we do these sessions in the afternoon, as Jason mentioned, I always like to choose a topic that still relates to our theme, and so something along the line of the miracles. And so we're going to be focusing on what is certainly one of the most odd, if not the oddest, miracle in all of the Bible. That fish that pays your taxes, it ranks up there. But this miracle in which Jesus heals a blind man, but he can't do it right the first time. You know, what's going on with that? Why does Jesus take a simple one-act healing and turn it into a two-step healing? I mean, why does Tommy Peeler take a one-syllable word and change it into a two-syllable word? I don't know if the reason is the same. You'll have to ask him. But we do need to ask this question. And incidentally, this is something I'm covering in a class currently. We're teaching the book of Mark this semester. And so hopefully my students have already heard some of this. I'm sure some of this will not be new to some of you. I hope it will not be new to my students because they're taking a test on that this very week. So the two-stage healing of the blind man, I've already given you really a spin here on what I see is going on, but that this is a key to the structure of the entire book of Mark, and I hope that it's a peg that you can hang onto and carry with you quite easily to understand what's going on in the book of Mark. So I want to begin just with a couple of pieces of information. I'm going to dwell a lot on this. A lot of what has been said has been well developed in a number of other lessons already. So some items that I call essential background. The first of these, of course, is that miracles are signs, and it has been repeatedly pointed out. A sign points to something other than itself. The miracles are themselves, we might call parables in action. They have the same kind of parabolic quality to them as the things we normally think of as the parables of Jesus. They both reveal and conceal at the same time. That is, they do point us to Jesus, but not everybody sees it. And so some witness a miracle and it makes no impression on them. Others witness the same miracle and they respond in trust. And what is it about these miracles? Well, we often get so preoccupied with the miracle. What were the physics of it? What laws were suspended? How does it work? It's kind of neat. Or we might get consumed with the question about whether miracles happen today or not. But that's pretty much like you think about the Walmart sign. I want a toaster, so let's go to the Walmart sign. Well, you're never going to get a toaster because you're too preoccupied with the sign. You have failed to see what the sign was pointing toward. And we get so caught up in the signs, we fail to see Jesus. We fail to see what the sign is really telling us about Jesus. And by that, I don't mean that we have a class and we say, well, here's a miracle. It shows that Jesus is powerful, or Jesus is compassionate, or Jesus has power over various things. Well, yeah, that's true. But there's something more fundamentally deeper and more profound about it that's going on. And when it comes to our particular miracle here, the healing of a blind man, I would direct your attention particularly to the exceptional lecture that Rusty Taylor did on John chapter 9. And we did intentionally choose that of all of the blind healing miracles, because that's pretty much more of what Jesus did than anything. And that would be our test case for that particular lecture. And it's an outstanding demonstration of what these healings of blind people are about. And as was pointed out at that time, it's rooted into a figure, a metaphor that really begins at the very start of the Bible, that God created light, and that was not an accident. There was a reason for that. And this whole theme of light and darkness and what it means to see, things like that. All throughout the book of Isaiah, you see this theme of light and darkness, probably more than any other of the Old Testament prophets, that the servant would be a light to the Gentiles. We're familiar with that expression. Frequently, Isaiah indicates that in the Messianic age, there would be the provision of sight to those that are blind, and not only meaning by that people who were physically incapable of seeing, but even people that were imprisoned in darkness. Because these ancient prisons were not well-lit cubicles with cable television and so on, like we might be more familiar with in our culture. I'm not advocating that we change to a prison system which everybody's imprisoned in a dark dungeon, but that was the reality. And bringing people out of a dungeon into the light is also part of that same imagery. Well, I want to actually look at this Old Testament imagery in Luke chapter 4. And you'll recall that Jesus, in his hometown synagogue at Nazareth, kicks off his ministry by reading this passage from the book of Isaiah, Isaiah chapter 61. We'll pick up in verse 17 of Luke chapter 4. The book of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. He opened the book, found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord." And then, of course, he sets down and declares to them that today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. Well, how Luke uses this passage is, it is fundamentally the theme of Jesus' ministry. And these echoes of Isaiah 61 keep coming up repeatedly throughout the Gospel of Luke. And we see how the very things that Isaiah had foreseen were coming true. And of course, what Isaiah was talking about was not so much physical eyesight and physical lameness and so on, but the miracles of Jesus are visual aids and demonstrations. And the lesson we learn is if one like Jesus can heal one who is physically blind, then how much more so that we should be able to realize he has the power to heal those of spiritual blindness. But you can't see that. And so you demonstrate it by something that people can see, one of these healings of the blind. And the Gospel of John becomes a particular chain of passages in the New Testament where John is particularly concerned about this theme of light and dark. He starts out in the beginning how Jesus himself is the creator. He is the light. He is the life of men. And he is the light of the world. He is recorded Jesus saying that on a couple of different occasions. And then we come to this story in John chapter 9. And of course, the neat thing about John and the miracles is it's kind of like, miracles for dummies, I guess you might say. You get chapter 6, the feeding of the 5,000, which you find in the other three Gospels just as surely. But those Gospel writers make a different use of that story, just like preachers today might take the same text and make different applications from it. And so Jesus has fed these people physically with actual literal bread. And then John records his sermon in the synagogue at Capernaum that he is the bread of life. And you'd have to be blind not to see the connection. And in chapter 11, Jesus proclaims himself to be the resurrection and the life. And yes, he's going to raise Lazarus physically, bodily from the dead, but Jesus wasn't really talking about physical resurrection as much as he was spiritual life. And so it is also in chapter 9, Jesus heals a man who is physically, literally blind. Well, what's the point of this? Well, so we don't miss it, right at the very end of the chapter, he says in verse 39, "For judgment I came into this world so that those who do not see may see, and that those who see may become blind." That part we often overlook and fail to appreciate. That was said by the Old Testament prophets quite repeatedly as well. And those of the Pharisees who were with him heard these things and said to him, "We are not blind too, are we?" Now, these may have been some pretty dense Pharisees, I don't know, but I would suspect they would have known whether they suffered from physical blindness or not. And they clearly get the point that the blindness is a figure, a metaphor for something else. And Jesus said, if you were blind, you would have no sin. Which I take it Jesus to mean if you would acknowledge your blindness, you would find the answer to it. But since you say we see, your sin remains. You have no interest in looking for the solution to your problem. And so all of that is what's going on here in Mark chapter 8 as well as we look at this text that has to do with the healing of this blind man in 2 stages. And so if you want to turn to Mark chapter 8, this miracle is a sign that points us to some great truth about Jesus. It is related to this overall theme of Jesus being the true light and us finding any sight and understanding in Jesus. But the story itself is quite short. Mark chapter 8, verse 22, they came to Bethsaida. They brought a blind man to Jesus and implored him to touch him. Taking the blind man by the hand, he brought him out of the village. After spitting on his eyes and laying his hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" Well, already you stop there and you say, what in the world is Jesus spitting in this man's face for? I believe in a Jesus that could have healed this blind man from across the country. I believe in a Jesus that could have just spoken a word and this man would have been healed. Or if Jesus laid hands on him, any number of other things, but spitting directly in his face. There is no culture on the planet that thinks that's a nice thing to do. This is universally degrading and humiliating. And when it's unnecessary, it makes you ask the question, why would Jesus do that? Are we people that believe in doing Bible things in Bible ways? I'll see you after the lecture. We'll come back and talk about it at the end if we have time. Well, do you see anything? He looked up and he said, I see men, for I see them like trees walking around. And again he laid his hands on his eyes, and he looked intently and was restored and began to see everything clearly. And Jesus sent him to his home, saying, do not even enter the village. Well, when we read texts of the Bible, there are questions that we really shouldn't be asking of the text. They're illegitimate questions. There are questions we're permitted to ask the text that we might have interest in, but may not be particularly critical to understanding the point. But there are some questions you are absolutely fundamentally compelled to ask. And this is one such case here. Why in the world did Jesus have to heal this man in 2 steps this way? And why does Mark record this story for us? Because Matthew and Luke and John did not see fit to record this story. And there are a lot of different ideas that some people have had. Maybe this man had a particularly bad case of blindness. Or Jesus had a bad day. He just wasn't up to par. I mean, all kinds of ideas that you hear people suggest. But of course, for any Bible believer, there is only one possible answer. And I get it most of the time correctly from little 6-year-old kids. I'll say, why in the world did Jesus do this? Because he wanted to. And that's absolutely right. That's the only reason, because he wanted to. We got to keep that in mind about a lot of things. Sometimes we say some of the silliest things like, if your God took 6 trillion years to create the world, you got a weak and a puny God. If he had to do it that way, he's weak and puny. Well, I grant you that. But if he had to do it in 6 days, he's a weak and puny God. Do we really picture God up there saying, man, I really want to do this in one day, but I just can't? If God was compelled to do it in 6 nanoseconds, he's a weak and a puny God. The only question is, why did he choose to do it that way? And that leads us to another question. What is his point? Because he has a point to it. He has a purpose, some reason for what he is doing. And so we're considering the question, what was Jesus' purpose here? Why did he want to do it this way? What point is he trying to teach us? And in connection with that, what point is Mark wanting to teach us as he records this as one of the few, only 4 unique stories that Mark gives us that aren't found in any of the other Gospels, and this is one of them. So why does it take these 2 attempts to heal the blind man? Well, you'll notice, first of all, there is no answer to that question explicitly given in the text. And so we have a decision to make right there. We can say, well, no, I'm one of these Bible-believing folks. I just read what the Bible says, and that's it. And I'm not going to do any thinking between the lines or reading between the lines. And so if the Bible doesn't tell me, I don't know. Well, again, I think you get a sense that there is no way you can read this text and not ask that question. It begs for an answer. And I think we can answer that question. And I think, in fact, our problem often is we are over-literalists on occasion. And I'm not advocating that we don't read the Bible literally, because the vast majority of it ought to be read that way. But more importantly, we need to read the Bible contextually. You know, a couple of years ago when I was talking about elders, this was really the main point I was making in that lesson, is how do we read Scripture contextually? And we actually do a pretty good job of it, as long as the topic is not controversial or some hot-button issue. And so if you go earlier in Mark chapter 2 to verses 21 and 22, and Jesus talks about how you put a new patch on old garments and put new wine in old wineskins and what's going to happen. In every Bible class I've ever sat in that talked about those 2 verses, people have always extracted some spiritual principle from those verses. And the question is, what justifies you doing that? Well, this lexicon over here says the word garment means... No, you're not going to find it in any dictionary, any of the words. You can take all the words apart all you want, and you will find nothing in the text that justifies you inserting something beyond the mere words. Where you find it is in the context. And we need to remember and understand that it is truly the context that gives you the greatest precision in your reading and understanding of Scripture. Another way of saying that is, you can take any statement, I don't care how clear and true it is, and twist it around where it says something different. Because that's how important, that's how fundamentally powerful context is. And we have another example of this in chapter 8. Jesus in the boat warns the disciples about the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Now, Matthew gets around to telling us that, in fact, Jesus was talking about teaching, which begs the question, why didn't he say teaching? Because he wants people to think. He's not spoon-feeding them the answer. Mark doesn't even tell us, after all, what the leaven is. He's leaving us to think about it and figure it out for ourselves. And the real point of that story, however, is that Jesus reprimands the disciples for their failure to understand what he's saying, even though he's not speaking very clearly. He's speaking in figures. He's speaking in metaphors. And why could he indict them for that? Because they should have known that's not Jesus. Jesus is not all about bread. He's not preoccupied with new recipes and new bakeries opening and so on. If they had been with Jesus long enough, they would know, that's not Jesus. And I think that takes us back to chapter 2. I may not know exactly what Jesus was talking about, but I know one thing. God the Creator did not come down and take on human form and suffer all that he did and die on a cross that he might teach me how to patch my clothing and store my wine. And so I know that's not what Mark chapter 2, verses 21 and 22 are about. Context. Here, the context of Jesus. And so I don't think we're bound simply to say, well, where in the text does it explicitly answer this question for us? The context gives us enough indication as to what's really going on here. So when we look at the context, what can we see? Well, here are the things I would describe as the clues to interpreting this passage correctly. First of all, you look at the story that immediately precedes the miracle of the healing of this man in 2 stages. And it is, in fact, this story of how the disciples are in the boat with Jesus. They've only got 1 loaf of bread with them. And Jesus says, watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And I'd just like to know how they felt at that moment. I mean, what was going through their mind? Like, oh, he's found out. You know, we only brought 1 loaf of bread. Now Jesus knows. And he's getting on to us. You know, my kids feel that way often. I'll ask a question and like, I'm in trouble, you know. And you can just picture the disciples getting in an argument. Well, John, why did you only bring 1 loaf? Well, I thought Peter got, you know. I mean, on and on it goes. I don't know what all they were saying in this discussion, but Jesus, aware of this, said, why do you discuss the fact you have no bread? Do you not yet see or understand? Do you have a hardened heart? Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? Do you not remember? And he reminds them of the example of the feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000. Well, here, seeing is used in a way to talk about understanding. And we use that same figure in English. Do you see what I'm talking about, right? Do you understand? And Jesus even quotes this passage from Jeremiah chapter 5, which is very similar to the version we find in Isaiah chapter 6. And it's something of an indictment to his disciples, that they are in the same category of these hard-hearted people who refuse to understand, who lived back in Isaiah's day and later in Jeremiah's day, that they just refuse to see, they refuse to hear. And so already we are set up to be thinking of sight as something that is spiritual and that we need to have eyes that we use to see. But he's not talking about physical eyes and physical sight, but what is our spiritual perception and understanding. And then we have the story itself, the miracle as we have read it. Well, look at the very next story that follows immediately on the heels of the healing of this blind man, and it is a story that we could put in the category of sight. The disciples see something about Jesus. And so Jesus went out along with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he questioned his disciples, saying to them, who do people say that I am? What is the opinion of the general populace? That is, what do they see? What do they understand about Jesus? And they told him, well, John the Baptist, others say Elijah, but others one of the prophets. Well, we know that's not right. They don't get it. They don't see who Jesus is. But he continued by questioning them, but who do you say that I am? Peter answered and said to him, you are the Christ. You know, short version compared to the more familiar one to us from Matthew. You're the Christ. You're the Messiah. And he warned them to tell no one about him. Well, I don't think Peter was the only one that had come to understand that Jesus was the Messiah, but he speaks, as is typical for Peter, for all of the disciples. They'd come to understand something that the populace did not know, and that is that Jesus is the Messiah. You'll notice in the potential answers that are given, John the Baptist, Elijah, one of the prophets, the disciples don't say, oh, some people think you're the Messiah. They don't even include that. Now, whether there were some or not, at least that's not the answer that is given. That's not how the popular opinion of Jesus is represented. He's some great man. He is like one of the Old Testament prophets. But Peter says, no, you are the Christ. And that's got to be one of the high moments in Peter's life, to make what is one of the most fundamentally significant and important proclamations about Jesus and who he is. And of course, if you read Matthew's account, he develops it more thoroughly. The great blessing, that Jesus pronounces upon Peter, because these things had not been revealed to him by flesh and blood, but by the Father. And he's given a great commendation by Jesus. But then look at the very next story that we run into, and what we have here is an example of blindness. And again, it's Peter who's going to lead the way. Notice verse 31, he began to teach them, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he was stating the matter plainly. He wasn't speaking in riddles, in parables, in metaphors here. He was just saying right out plainly what was going to happen. And what is implied here and stated more explicitly in Matthew's gospel, Matthew chapter 16, verse 21, it is only at this point where the disciples have come to understand that Jesus is the Messiah, that Jesus begins to explicitly predict his death. He had never done this before. There are hints of it. There are veiled references to it in, for example, what happened to John the Baptist and other things like that. But this is the point at which Jesus begins explicitly teaching his disciples, this is what is going to happen. I am going to Jerusalem. I'm going to be mistreated, to suffer, to be killed, and to rise again. And then notice in verse 32, Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Uses the same word of Jesus rebuking the unclean spirits. And I don't know exactly what it is that Peter said. Again, I'd like to have been there. And I'm sure Peter was well-intentioned. Now, Jesus, you're always one of these glasses half empty kind of people, kind of pessimistic. But we ought to be more positive about that. God's on our side, and as long as we do the right thing, it doesn't matter if there's just a few of us. Why, you remember what old Gideon did with just a handful of people? It'll all be fine. Again, I don't know exactly what Peter told Jesus, but I know two things he had to have told him in one way or the other. You don't have to go to the cross. And Jesus, you don't know what you're talking about. There's two of us standing here, and when it comes to knowing the will of God, I know better than you do. And that's exactly why this represents what must certainly be a really low point in Peter's life. Now, granted, I think Peter can top this one later on, but turning around, seeing his disciples, Jesus rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you're not setting your mind on the things of God, but the things of man." I mean, to turn right around and call Peter Satan? Because what Peter says represents the greatest threat to Jesus. It is the greatest temptation. You don't have to go to the cross. That's the very thing he came for. Without that, it's pointless. His work is undermined completely. Satan wins. And the last thing Peter needs to be doing is whispering in the ear of Jesus, you don't have to go to the cross. He's doing the work of Satan on behalf of Satan. And what it shows us is, even though Peter had come to understand that Jesus is the Christ, he has no clue what that means. And it really raises the question, I'm sure, in the mind of Peter and us as the reader, what kind of Messiah is this? What kind of kingdom of this Messiah is this? Maybe I was wrong in proclaiming him to be the Messiah. That's certainly not the Messiah that I expected or that Mom and Dad taught me about. What's going on here? And so we have to consider the question, what kind of Messiah is this Jesus as it turns out? And the one final story, the next one that follows on the heels of this, is the Transfiguration story in Mark chapter 9. And of course, one of the unique features of the Transfiguration story is it greatly echoes the baptism of Jesus, because the same voice speaks out of the cloud and identifies Jesus as God's Son, in whom he is well pleased. And so, well, why does God do this? And I would describe this as a kind of starting over again, a rebooting of the ministry of Jesus. If this is how Jesus' ministry needs to begin, and it's gotten so off track that the disciples don't even have a clue who Jesus really is or what it means for him to be the Messiah, let's go back to the beginning and start over. And so the voice will proclaim Jesus to be God's Son, but then you remember there's something very important added to this. This time, you listen. And I think that's God's way of saying, Peter, when Jesus tells you he's got to go to Jerusalem and suffer and die, guess what? That's exactly God's plan. And that is exactly what has to happen. And so I think what we find represented in the miracle is, there are those who do not see at all. They are completely blind. And those are the people of the general population and you ask them who is Jesus, they're so off base they don't even get close. But here are the disciples, the privileged ones, who have been able to walk with Jesus and benefit from his teaching, and they do see something about Jesus that nobody else can see. He is the Messiah. But have they come to full understanding? And the answer to that is obviously no. And it's illustrated perfectly with Peter. On the one hand, he does see. On the other hand, he does not see. Or we might say his sight of Jesus is like trees walking around. It's not as clear as it needs to be. And if, in fact, the whole point of the gospel is to bring us to an understanding of who Jesus is, that he is the Messiah, then the Gospel of Mark should pretty much end in chapter 8. That's it. We've arrived. You know, you think about it as a piece of literature. Who am I supposed to be identifying with as I read this story? Am I supposed to be thinking, I'm Jesus. You know, I'm the hero of the story. Or I'm one of the Pharisees. Or I'm one of the common people. No. We are invited to be one of the disciples, walking with Jesus, listening to Jesus, considering the things Jesus is saying and doing. And if you really do that, then you're really a whole lot more sympathetic to these disciples, because from a distance, we like to point a finger and say, oh, that silly Peter. Oh, what a moron, James and John, wanting to call down fire from heaven. I tell you, I wanted to do that a million times. And not on some Samaritans, but on some church somewhere. And so you identify with the struggle to know Jesus and to know him better. And so we do see, but we don't completely see. And even that story is illustrated later in the 9th chapter, the words of the anguished father of that demon-possessed boy. I believe, but help my unbelief. And it seems like this man has a better insight and understanding about Jesus than the 12 disciples do. Yeah, I've come to see something about Jesus, but there's more that I yet need to see. And now, as I've said, I think this is all key to the structure of the book of Mark. We have two halves of the book, and we've just gotten to the first half, the end of the first half. And there's a whole nother half to go. And obviously, it's not Mark's intention to convince us that Jesus is the Christ, because we already got that. So what are the rest of the chapters for? Well, I would suggest that Mark has hinted about the outline of his book in the very first verse of the book, when he talks about the gospel or the good news of Jesus Christ, Son of God. And what do we have right here at the end of the first half of the book but a confession by Peter that Jesus is the Christ? But you will notice there are a lot of people that identify Jesus throughout the book of Mark. The voice of God himself out of the sky does it on 2 occasions. Demons are constantly doing it and being told to shut up. But there are only 2 people in the entire book that confess who Jesus is as a means of identification. And who is that? But Peter at the end of the first half, and the centurion at the end, at the crucifixion. Truly, this man was the Son of God. Now, I'm not suggesting the Christ and Son of God are some profoundly 2 different titles of Jesus, but that this is Mark's way of saying that, yes, when you get halfway through my book, you should know enough about Jesus to be convicted that he is the Messiah of promise, the one that the Old Testament scriptures have foretold. But until you understand what kind of Messiah this is, you're not going to get it. And you're not going to see fully. You're not going to see clearly. And so there are these 2 stages to gain true sight. The first 8 chapters, basically, to lead us to this conviction that Jesus is the Messiah. And the second half, that the Messiah, if you want to define the job description of Messiah, it is the one who serves to the point of sacrifice, who sacrifices to the point of suffering, who suffers to the point of full surrender, and all of that to selflessly serve people that don't deserve it. Until you understand that about Jesus, you don't know who Jesus is. And we have churches full of people who partly see. They come and freely confess Jesus is the Christ, but they have no concept. that means that we are called to service. If we would be a disciple of Jesus, if we're going to follow Jesus, we must deny ourselves utterly and completely. And we must take up our own cross to be crucified with Jesus. And then we can follow him in this kingdom of selflessness and sacrifice and suffering. And so that's who Jesus is. And that's what you learn as you follow Jesus through the rest of the book and you get to the cross that culminates in the final and ultimate and clearest proof about who is this Jesus and what kind of Messiah he is exactly. And I want to come back then to Jesus spitting in the face of this man. Why spit in the face of this man who cannot see? And you may remember there is one other person in the book of Mark who is spit in the face when he cannot see, and that is Jesus. And it's such a clear echo that it invites us to consider that this degrading act that this man went through when being healed of his blindness is kind of a foreshadowing of the same degrading act as Jesus will undergo it in the 14th chapter. Jesus himself had predicted in chapter 10 they would spit upon him, and that's exactly what they do in chapter 14. And as you really start looking at it, all of the healing stories in Mark have elements that point to the cross of Jesus Christ. You think about the demon-possessed man in chapter 5, who is naked, who is afflicted by this legion, who is gashed and cut in his flesh and destined to live in the tombs. And Jesus will live out that in his own experience, in his trial and his crucifixion. The leper who is told to go and present a testimony to the priests. The only other place in the book where a testimony is given to the priests is at the end in the trial of Jesus. And it's what gets him crucified. Or the paralyzed man in chapter 2 who is immobile and cannot move. But that you might know he has the power to forgive sins, let him rise. And that's exactly what Jesus does. The man who stretches out his hand that it may be healed of its witheredness. And Jesus will stretch out his hands as well in the cross. The demon-possessed boy in chapter 9, as the demon is cast out and he hurls all of his power and demon effort to destroy this child so much that he is left apparently dead. But he is not dead. And so Satan will hurl all of his power against Jesus and fail likewise. What is happening here is simply the working out in real life, enacted in a kind of a parable and action form, the fact of what the Bible has told us several times. You think about all these healing stories in Mark, and I'm reminded of this passage as Matthew records in Matthew chapter 8, verse 17, a quotation from Isaiah 53 and verse 4, that Jesus takes our suffering and our infirmities upon himself. And clearly that's understood ultimately in a spiritual sense, but Matthew uses it in connection with actual physical infirmities that Jesus is taking and bearing. And what we will find is that Jesus is literally and physically taking some of these same sufferings upon himself in his crucifixion experience. Is that all that it is? No. That is merely a sign, again, that Jesus is taking upon himself also all of those spiritual infirmities and weaknesses and bearing them for us. And I think that this is something of a comfort to Jesus when it comes his own turn to be spit in his face while being blinded, while being tortured by the forces of Satan and so on. He can remember, these things have happened before, and God was victorious. God provided the deliverance, and God will also, in this case, with Jesus. And ultimately, of course, through Jesus' own suffering these things, that's the mechanism that actually provides the restoration and the deliverance. By his wounds, we are healed. And that's Isaiah chapter 53 and verse 5. And that's quoted in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 24. And I think all of those things are true, and we're reminded of those claims of Scripture when you look at these stories, and they all have elements of Jesus' own suffering. and bearing of these things in the cross. That is, if Jesus bore our infirmities and our weaknesses and our sufferings and so on anywhere, it is truly most fully and completely in the cross. And again, we can see a physical element to that, but not to lose sight of the spiritual that all of these physical things point to. But I think there's one final lesson to learn, and I especially think about this. Why does Jesus spit in the face of this poor blind man? Why is Jesus the one causing him this humiliation and this degradation? Is Jesus just being mean? No. I think what Jesus is telling him is this is what you're in store for. Because to be a disciple of Jesus is to share in his suffering. And we're told that time and time again. That yeah, Jesus will bear our suffering, but we must also share in the suffering of Jesus. And so yes, we will be spit upon, and we will be tortured, we will be assaulted by Satan. But just as the victory was a comfort to Jesus, that he would have his own victory in his resurrection, it's a reminder to us as true disciples, this is the kind of Jesus we follow, a Jesus of suffering, a Jesus of sacrifice, a Jesus of absolute selfless serving other people regardless of whether they deserve it. And that's what we've signed up for, and that's who we try to follow. And I tell you, I think about this when Jesus explicitly explains, this is the kind of Messiah I am. I'm going to suffer and I'm going to die. You know, he does that 3 times in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8, chapter 9, chapter 10. And the very next story, every time Jesus does that, the disciples do something stupid. Argue about who's greatest in the kingdom. Or like Peter did, we saw in chapter 8. And it'd shake my head at a distance. Oh, Peter, how could you do that? Oh, you moron disciples. How could you? I mean, Jesus has just explained to you it's not that kind of kingdom. It's not about earthly power and glory. It's a kingdom of suffering and sacrifice and service. How do you not get it? And yet I get up and preach the same lesson. Jesus went to the cross, and I turn around and do more stupid things than the disciples ever did. I just don't get it. And so I'm still blind, and I still don't see clearly like I need to. And that's why I need to keep reading the book of Mark. And yes, I'll shake my head. Jesus is the Christ. He is the Messiah. But do I really understand what that means? Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief. God bless you, each one, as we strive to follow him.